The world's largest private technology company is going public again. For details on Dell's plans, we're joined now by Brooke Sutherland, a Bloomberg opinion columnist. Give us the basics. It has to do with VMware and that tracking stock.
It is very complicated, we should say up front. So what Dell is doing is it is essentially going public again by acquiring that tracking stock, which is meant to mirror the value of VMware. Now recall that Dell owns a controlling stake in VMware via its buyout of EMC, which happened in 2016. Now, a lot of people had thought it would also acquire VMware or somehow combine with VMware in this process, and it is not doing that. VMware will remain a publicly traded, somewhat independent entity.
Now, what does it list then? A new class of shares, Class C shares. I mean, Dell is just a master of, I'm not sure if it's fair to call it financial engineering, but it's certainly some kind of financial innovation.
Yes, I definitely think financial innovation, engineering, whatever you want to call it, there's a lot of moving pieces here that's not necessarily creating something that new. It's more a means of consolidating these different parts, these different interests in Dell's empire. Now, there's a benefit to that just in lessening the complexity and just sort of a realization that the structure that they had was intermediate. It wasn't meant to be a long-term viable structure for this company. But what this does not do is necessarily mitigate Dell's debt load. And that was a lot of the reason why they were looking at some of these transactions in the first place. So they're still going to have to figure out how exactly they deal with that. Also, tax law changes that have made, deducting the interest on that debt significantly more expensive for Dell. There's not really an answer yet as to how they're going to solve that. So, I mean, this seems to be the best outcome in terms of satisfying VMware holders who wanted to remain independent. But in terms of Dell, it's still going to be a very complex company with a convoluted structure, a lot of debt pressures, and just a need to sell its story to investors.
Yeah, I mean, the backdrop, Brooke, is pretty upbeat. A strong first quarter, strong tech spending. He's clearly trying to push the company into being a cloud player, offering customers software from a suite of smaller companies. I mean, how's it doing in that cloud push?
Well, I will say there's not much investor appetite for these sort of tech supermarkets that offer all kinds of different services. And a lot of the legacy Dell, and even to some extent EMC, is not necessarily fast growing. That's not the sweet spot for tech. VMware is. That's more cloud-based software. That's this visualization software. It's really made VMware stand out, but they won't necessarily have control of that. They'll still get benefits from that growth through their controlling stake, but this doesn't necessarily, like I said, solve some of their problems with the debt load.
Yeah, I mean, you did sort of say that as in, you don't have an answer. Hence, I'm going to ask you the question, what is the answer? It's over 50 billion, isn't it? How does it manage that debt load? What are the analysts saying?
I think we're just going to have to see how they find a way to do that. But clearly that was a lot of the motivation to looking at some of these structures in the first place. I guess they manage it by just continuing to harvest the cash flow. I will say this does leave open the option for a combination with VMware down the road. That door is not completely closed. Dell will assign this governance agreement with VMware that will allow the company to continue to operate somewhat independently. But that does not mean that there can't be a transaction. It just means that VMware's independent board directors have to sign off on a deal. So to me, at least, I look at this as more of an intermediate step that eventually gets us to a place where all of Dell's technology interests are consolidated in one place.
It's so fascinating, isn't it? What is likely to be the demand for this stock?
I think that's going to be an open question. Like I said, these tech supermarkets where they're very sort of sprawling in all of these different areas and not necessarily growing very quickly have not done super well. I mean, you look at HPE, that has arguably fared better than Dell, and still that stock, I don't know if you would necessarily call it a high flyer. So it's sort of interesting to see Dell re-entering the public markets. If you remember, a big reason why he left while he did this buyout of his company is he felt like public market investors weren't necessarily giving him the right perspective. They weren't appreciating his transformation of the company, and he felt like he could do it better in the private market. Now, clearly, he's coming back, but he'll have to win over some of those public market investors. I will say this time is different in that he has a controlling stake in the entity, so the ability of minority shareholders to intervene and protest against the plan that he wants to do is somewhat more limited.